A little girl was kidnapped in 1856. 70 years later, they found her diary that revealed everything under the dim glow of an oil lamp. The diary trembled in the hands of the archivist. Its pages, brittle as autumn leaves, whispered secrets that had slept for 70 years. The first line alone was enough to make his heart falter. "If anyone finds this, please tell my mother I never stopped trying to come home." In 1856, a little girl vanished without a trace. Her name had almost been erased from memory until this diary surfaced in a collapsing farmhouse in the outskirts of Vermont. But what it contained was far more than a simple confession or the ramblings of a frightened child. It was a window into something no one was meant to see. Imagine this: a quiet village wrapped in snow, the year fading into darkness, and the echoes of a single child's scream swallowed by the wind. For decades, her disappearance was dismissed as one of those tragedies history forgets. But as you're about to see, this story was never truly forgotten. It was buried under guilt, lies, and something that even the locals refused to name aloud. You're about to enter a world where faith became obsession, where justice was silenced, and where one girl's words refused to die. And believe me, no one was prepared for what they discovered inside those pages. Every entry, every trembling line in that diary seemed to breathe. It spoke of rooms that didn't exist on any blueprint, of strangers who came and went without leaving footprints, and of rituals held in the dead of night. Some say the ink itself was mixed with tears. Others whisper it wasn't ink at all. Tonight, you and I are going to uncover what really happened to that little girl in 1856. We'll follow her words into the darkness that swallowed her, and if you stay until the end, you'll hear a detail that was never made public. A secret kept sealed in those pages until now, because what they found 70 years later wasn't just a diary. It was evidence of cruelty, of devotion twisted into madness, and of a truth that rewrote the town's history forever. So take a deep breath. The deeper we go, the colder it gets. And remember, if you love unveiling hidden dark histories like this, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, stay with me until the very end, and I promise you'll discover something that still chills historians to this day. Now, let's open the first page together. The year was 1856. The air in northern Vermont was heavy with the scent of pine and snow and the kind of silence that only old forests know. The American Civil War had not yet begun, but unrest was already brewing beneath the polite facades of small towns. Industrial progress was creeping north, religion ruled the hearts of the people, and secrets, especially those involving children, were sealed behind church doors and family pride. The town of Hollow Creek, barely a cluster of wooden homes and a solitary chapel, sat at the edge of the wilderness. It was a place where time moved slower, where everyone knew everyone else, or thought they did. At dusk, the streets were deserted, as if the town itself feared the dark. Candles burned low in the windows, prayers were whispered, and yet something unseen lingered in the air. It was here that little Clara Wren lived with her mother, a seamstress, and her father, a veteran of the Mexican-American War. They were not wealthy, but they were loved. Clara was 8 years old, with a curious mind and an old, leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere. She filled it with sketches of the woods, strange symbols she claimed to have seen carved into trees, and questions about the stars that her father could never answer. Hollow Creek had its stories. Some spoke of old burial grounds beneath the chapel. Others told of a fire decades earlier that consumed the orphanage that once stood where the church now loomed. Few dared to question it aloud, especially the Reverend, whose sermons often ended with trembling voices and tears. "Evil," he would say, "lurks not in the forest, but in those who forget to fear it." The winter of 1856 came early that year, cruel and merciless. Crops failed, Animals vanished from the barns, and families spoke of strange cries in the woods at night, like a child calling for help. Most dismissed them as the wind, but Clara's mother swore she heard her daughter's name carried through the cold. Then, one morning, Clara was gone. Her footprints led only a few yards from the porch before they vanished entirely. The snow was undisturbed beyond that point, as if she had been lifted into the sky. The townsfolk searched for weeks. The river was dragged, the woods combed, every attic and cellar opened, but nothing was ever found. All that remained was Clara's notebook, left on her bed, its final page torn clean out. The Reverend declared it God's will, though his hands shook as he said it, and Hollow Creek moved on, burying the loss beneath layers of silence and time. But the truth had never left. It was waiting, in walls, in letters, in the breath of those who remembered but dared not speak. 70 years later, in 1926, a team of historians restoring an abandoned farmhouse stumbled upon something impossible, a sealed compartment beneath the floorboards of what used to be a child's room. Inside was a diary bound in faded red cloth. The ink had browned, the pages curled, but the handwriting was unmistakable, small, looping, and alive. It was signed Clara Wren, 1856. What the historians didn't yet know was that the house once belonged to the Reverend S. family, and that diary, hidden under their floor, would unravel everything Hollow Creek had tried to forget. Now picture it, the farmhouse at dusk, the walls sighing with age, the snow falling like ash outside, the candle flickers, and the first page turns. The air grows colder, the shadows seem to shift closer. What was written inside those pages would not only explain what happened to Clara, but expose a darkness that had lived among them all along. Clara Wren was the kind of child who made people pause when they saw her, curious, bright, and with eyes that always seemed to notice more than they should. Her mother, Margaret, often said she had been born seeing the world sideways. While other children played with dolls, Clara spent hours in the attic, sketching the shapes she saw in candlelight or tracing patterns in the frost that gathered on the windows. Her father, Thomas, adored her imagination, but Margaret worried. "She dreams too much," she would whisper at night, "and the world isn't kind to dreamers." Margaret herself was a quiet woman, hardened by loss. Her hands were always busy, mending clothes for the townsfolk, cooking bread for the Reverend S. gatherings. But her eyes carried the ache of someone who'd buried too many hopes. Thomas was her balance, a man of reason, yet haunted by the ghosts of war. He'd fought years earlier, returning home with a limp and a shadow that followed him everywhere. Clara, in her innocence, was his light. He used to lift her onto his shoulders and tell her stories about stars that never faded and promises that could never be broken. The Reverend Elijah Moore stood at the center of Hollow Creek's fragile peace. Tall, gaunt, and eloquent, he had the kind of voice that made people believe he'd been chosen by God himself. But beneath his sermons about salvation and purity, there was something else, an intensity that unsettled even the faithful. He lived alone in the rectory behind the chapel, where candlelight never seemed to die, even past midnight. It was said that he never slept. When Clara disappeared, the Reverend was the first to comfort the grieving family. He prayed beside Margaret every night, insisting that the Lord had a plan beyond human sight. Yet his visits grew more frequent, his gaze lingering too long on the child's drawings left behind, his hands trembling whenever he touched the pages. There was also Ruth Ellis, a widow who lived next door to the Wrens. She was the one who first noticed the Reverend entering the Wren house late at night, always when the town slept. Ruth had seen much in her 50 years, births, deaths, and the quiet decay of truth in Hollow Creek, but what she witnessed that winter made her blood run cold. Still, she said nothing. In Hollow Creek, silence was safer than truth. When the diary was found 70 years later, the people who studied it could almost feel these lives breathing again. The words inside weren't just the fears of a missing child. They were fragments of real people bound by faith, fear, and guilt. Each entry carried a heartbeat: Clara's longing for her parents, Margaret's quiet despair, Thomas's struggle against unseen forces, and Ruth's helplessness as she watched darkness take root in her town. Reading the diary aloud, the historian in 1926, Professor Harold Linton, found himself unable to sleep for nights. He wrote in his notes that Clara's voice felt alive, as if the ink itself was still wet. He described how her words shifted over time, from playful observations to something darker. Mentions of the man who prays without God, the room beneath the floor, and the light that hums in the dark. Through her words, Clara became more than a lost child. She became a witness. Her fear was tangible, her hope fragile but unbroken. And as each person connected to her story emerged from the past, one truth became undeniable. Every soul in Hollow Creek carried a piece of the mystery that took her away. The closer we get to her words, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was the unraveling of a community's faith, the collision between innocence and corruption. And the child who once filled her notebook with stars had unknowingly captured the moment the light in Hollow Creek began to die. The first clue came not from the diary itself, but from the floor beneath it. When Professor Linton's assistant lifted the loose boards of the child's room, a strange pattern was revealed, symbols carved into the wood, arranged in a perfect circle. They weren't letters or numbers, but something older, almost ritualistic. The markings had been scorched into the planks, as if made by heated iron rather than a knife. At first, they thought it might have been a childish attempt at decoration. But when Linton compared the carvings with one of Clara's sketches from the diary, his breath caught. The drawing was identical, same shape, same order, drawn 70 years earlier. Beneath it, Clara had written a single sentence. He said these signs keep the voices away. The team felt a chill run through the room. Voices. The word lingered like smoke. That night, Linton sat alone with the diary, candlelight flickering against the yellowed pages. The entries began as innocent ramblings about the weather, her cat, and her mother's bread. But then came a change. Her handwriting grew uneven, urgent. She began writing about the man in the black coat, someone who came to the house after sunset, always when her father was away. She wrote that he carried a small box that hummed softly when opened, and that her mother cried after he left. Then came the line that froze Linton, S-hand mid-turn. He says the cellar keeps the light safe, but I heard something crying down there. The farmhouse cellar had long been sealed. Locals claimed the foundation was unstable, but when the team examined it, they found the entrance covered by nailed boards and a layer of plaster. Hastily done, as though someone had wanted to erase its existence entirely. When they pried it open, a cold draft swept upward, carrying the stench of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like rust or blood. The candle flickered violently. The air felt heavy, wrong. One of the workers swore he heard a whisper before they descended. The cellar walls were lined with faint traces of soot, as if candles had once burned there for hours. In the center lay a small, rusted chain bolted into the stone floor. Nearby, a broken porcelain doll sat in the dirt, its eyes missing, its smile cracked. Linton found another clue near the wall. A fragment of paper pressed flat between the stones. It was a torn piece from the diary, written in the same looping hand. The message was brief. He told me to write what I see when the light hums. The discovery sent a ripple through the historians. What did she mean by the light hums? Electricity hadn't reached Hollow Creek in 1856. What could possibly have produced light or sound beneath the floor? Every corner of that cellar seemed to breathe, as if the house itself remembered what had happened. Linton marked the symbols, the chain, the doll, all physical remnants of something more than tragedy, and when he climbed back to the main room, he noticed something new. On the far wall, half hidden beneath peeling wallpaper, was another circle of symbols, larger this time, and freshly redrawn. Someone else had been there before them, someone who wanted to keep the voices away. But what lay behind those carvings, and what had been sealed inside that cellar for 70 years, was a truth none of them were prepared to face. Professor Linton could not shake the feeling that the air in that house was alive. Each night as he studied Clara's diary, the same words echoed in his head. He said these signs, keep the voices away. The more he read, the clearer it became. Clara had not been an ordinary child lost to misfortune. She had been silenced by the very people sworn to protect her. The next entries in her diary revealed the slow unraveling of her world. Clara wrote about her mother's growing fear and her father's absence, weeks at a time, gone to help the Reverend with church duties. She described nights when her mother would weep in the kitchen, whispering prayers that Clara didn't understand. And then, one entry, dated just days before her disappearance, spoke of the gathering beneath the church and the promise of light that burns away sin. Linton knew the phrase. In old religious texts from the 1800s, the light that burns sin often referred to purifying rituals used by fringe sects, ceremonies meant to cleanse souls through suffering. If the Reverend Elijah Moore had practiced such rites, it meant the church had been hiding something monstrous behind its sermons of redemption. The injustice began to take shape. Clara wasn't just a missing child. She was a victim of faith twisted into cruelty. Her innocence had been offered up in the name of salvation. As Linton pieced the fragments together, another layer of the town's past emerged. Newspaper archives from 1857 revealed that several other children had gone missing over the span of 3 winters. Each case was dismissed as runaways or accidents, though no bodies were ever found. The Reverend had personally conducted every funeral service, despite there being no remains to bury. Clara's diary mentioned hearing others in the dark, voices crying for help below her room. She wrote about being told she was chosen and that the light would soon take her away. The handwriting shook, ink blotted by tears. Linton realized that Clara had been documenting her own descent into captivity, and that her final pages might hold proof of what really happened under the chapel. As the historian shared his findings with local officials, he was met with silence and resistance. The descendants of Hollow Creek's founders still controlled much of the land. They called his discoveries slander, warning him to stop digging into graves best left closed. It was then Linton understood. The town still protected the Reverend's legacy. The injustice was not buried in the past. It was preserved by those who benefited from the silence. Late one evening, as snow fell against the windows, Linton found a note slipped under his door. It was written in hurried, unfamiliar handwriting. "You're not the first to read her words. The last man who tried heard the humming too." He felt the cold crawl up his spine. Someone else had been following his research, someone who knew the story was not finished. And yet, despite the fear that crept in, Linton couldn't stop. He knew that Clara's voice had been stolen once. He refused to let it be buried again. So he turned to the next page of her diary, and there, scrawled in shaky ink, were words that deepened the mystery and sharpened the pain. They said the light would free us, but it only took the ones who screamed. That single sentence turned a forgotten tragedy into a haunting revelation, one that would expose just how deep the town's sins truly ran. The snow outside had turned the world into a silent white tomb. Inside the farmhouse, only the soft hiss of the oil lamp broke the stillness as Professor Linton leaned over the diary once more. He had reached the final intact section before the missing pages, the part Clara had titled, "The Knights of Light." Her handwriting was different here, uneven, frantic, the letters scratched as if carved in fear. "He said we must go below to see the light." Mama cried. "She said the light isn't from God. He told her God made it through him." The words sent a chill through Linton's spine. He could almost hear her voice trembling through the ink. Each sentence grew darker, describing the room beneath the floor, where the Reverend gathered a few chosen families. Clara wrote that she wasn't allowed to speak, only to listen, as the light hummed louder each night. Driven by equal parts dread and curiosity, Linton decided to explore beneath the chapel ruins that still stood in Hollow Creek. With the help of a local caretaker, he located the basement entrance, buried behind years of collapsed timber and ice. When the door finally gave way, a blast of cold air poured out, so cold it bit through their gloves. The basement was smaller than he imagined. The ceiling hung low, and soot marked the stone walls. At the far end, there was an alcove, half sealed by brick. The caretaker refused to go near it. "This place was closed for a reason," he muttered, stepping back. But Linton pressed forward, his lantern trembling in his hand. The first thing he saw were remnants of melted candles and metal hooks bolted to the walls. Then he saw something worse, marks etched into the floor, the same symbols from Clara's diary, blackened and burned into the stone. In the center lay a narrow wooden chair, its legs scorched, its seat stained dark. Around it were small bones, animal perhaps, but one fragment was unmistakably human. A child's rib. Linton staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He turned to call the caretaker, but his voice caught when he noticed something else. Carved into the chair's backrest, faint but visible beneath the soot, were 3 letters. C.W. Clara Wren. He stood there frozen, his mind refusing to accept what he saw. This wasn't just evidence of ritual. It was proof that the Reverend S. ceremonies had taken a human toll. Whatever light they sought, it demanded a sacrifice. That night, back in his room at the inn, Linton couldn't sleep. Every creak of the walls sounded like whispering, every flicker of the lamp like a breath. He opened the diary again, searching for something, anything to explain what he'd found. Near the end of the last entry, written in faint ink, was a new line he hadn't noticed before. It appeared almost hidden beneath the margin. "If the light finds me again, it will take him too." A strange humming filled the air. Linton froze. It was faint, barely audible, but undeniably there, a low vibration like the drone of distant machinery. He checked the lamp, steady flame. The sound was coming from beneath the floorboards. He knelt, pressing his ear to the wood. The hum grew louder, steady, rhythmic, as if pulsing in time with his heartbeat. His breath quickened. There was nothing beneath that room but the frozen ground. No electricity, no pipes, nothing that could make a sound. The caretaker's warning echoed in his mind. "You are not the first to read her words." The humming stopped. Silence fell heavy and absolute. And then, 3 soft knocks from beneath the floor. Linton stumbled backward, his lantern shaking violently, shadows dancing along the walls. He stared at the spot where the sound had come from, heart pounding, until another faint whisper seemed to drift from below. Words so quiet he almost believed they came from his own mind. He said the light would save us. That was when Linton knew. The diary wasn't just telling the story of the past. It was still alive, and whatever had haunted Clara Wren in 1856 had just awakened again. Morning brought no relief. The pale light of dawn only deepened the dread that had taken root in Professor Linton's chest. He barely slept, haunted by the memory of those knocks and the echo of Clara's final words. Yet something inside him, part curiosity, part duty, drove him back to the farmhouse. He had to know what lay beneath. He arrived to find the caretaker gone, his tools scattered near the door. The man had left in such haste that his coat still hung on a chair. On the table lay a single note, scribbled in uneven handwriting. "It's awake again. Don't go back under." Linton ignored the warning. He couldn't. Every rational part of him screamed to leave, yet his hands were already clearing the debris from the cellar entrance. As he descended, lantern in hand, the air grew colder. The scent of damp earth and iron returned, stronger than before. In the dim glow, something new caught his eye. An object lodged between two stones in the wall. He pried it loose, and his heart nearly stopped. It was a small wooden box, scorched around the edges, just as Clara had described in her diary. The lid was sealed with melted wax, stamped with the symbol from the floor, a circle crossed by 3 lines. He hesitated, then forced it open. Inside, wrapped in decayed cloth, was a lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon. Beneath it, a folded piece of paper. The ink was brown with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret Wrens. "To whoever finds this, they took her in God's name. The Reverend said the light must be fed. I tried to stop them. Forgive me." Linton's hands trembled. Margaret had known. She had witnessed it all, the ceremonies, the disappearances, and had tried to hide the truth before she died. But the diary had survived, waiting to be found, as if Clara herself refused to let her story end in silence. Then, just as he turned the paper over, another detail caught his eye. The back of the page contained a map, a rough drawing of the church grounds, with a mark beneath the altar labeled "The Second Chamber." Linton froze. A second chamber. The cellar he had found might not have been the only one. He rushed to the chapel ruins, snow crunching under his boots. Beneath the collapsed floorboards, he followed the crude directions from the map until his lantern revealed a hollow spot under the altar stones. He pried one loose and uncovered a narrow passage, descending deeper into darkness. The air below was colder still, and the hum, the same low vibration he'd heard in his room, returned. Faint but steady, the corridor ended in a heavy iron door, sealed shut by rust and time. Etched into its surface were the same strange symbols, but this time accompanied by words scratched in Latin: "Lux devorat innocentium." The light devours innocence. Linton stepped back, breath shaking. The phrase wasn't just symbolic, it was a confession. The Reverend's light had been something far darker, something that required suffering to exist. He turned to leave, but as his lantern flickered, he noticed something carved into the stone beside the door. A name. Elijah Moore, 1923. The Reverend had died in 1870. So who had written it? And what exactly had been sealed inside that chamber only 3 years before the diary was found? Professor Linton could barely breathe as he traced the date carved beside the iron door. 1923. Nearly half a century after Reverend Elijah Moore's death, someone had been here, someone who knew about the chamber and had continued whatever rituals had begun in 1856. The thought clawed at his mind. What if the Reverend's faith hadn't died with him? What if it had survived, hidden, passed down like a disease? He returned to the farmhouse and spread every document, diary page, and photograph across the table. The air felt electric with realization. The town's silence wasn't neglect, it was deliberate. The descendants of Hollow Creek-S founders, still among the wealthiest families in Vermont, were all connected to Reverend Moore. Some had changed their names, married into others, and erased traces of their lineage. But not all. One name appeared again and again in church ledgers, property records, and even in the funding for the 1926 restoration project that led to the diary's discovery. Elias Moore, the Reverend's great-grandson, Linton's pulse quickened. The man who had financed the restoration had the same name carved into the iron door. E. Moore, 1923. It wasn't just coincidence. The diary hadn't been found by accident. It had been placed there. The restoration project had been a cover, an attempt to retrieve or protect something hidden beneath the chapel before others could uncover it. Digging through archived correspondence, Linton found a letter dated 1924 from Elias to the town council. In it, he warned of dangerous relics of misguided worship and requested the sealing of certain areas of the old church grounds. He also mentioned a light that must never be reignited. The phrasing mirrored Clara's diary almost word for word. As Linton read deeper, patterns began to emerge. The same circle and line symbol appeared on multiple town documents, discreetly stamped in the corners, on school records, building permits, even birth certificates. It wasn't a decorative mark, it was a sign of belonging, a secret fraternity of descendants guarding the legacy of the Reverend's light. When Linton looked closer at a faded photograph from the 1920s restoration team, his heart skipped. Among the men posing before the chapel ruins was a tall figure standing slightly apart, face shadowed beneath his hat. The caption read simply, "Elias Moore, Project Overseer." In his hand, he held a small wooden box, the same kind described by Clara, and the same one Linton had found in the cellar. He leaned back, the truth beginning to form like frost on glass. The Moores hadn't been trying to hide their past. They had been preserving it, ensuring the rituals continued under the guise of history and tradition. And when the diary re-emerged in 1926, it had been because something went wrong, something the new lightkeeper couldn't contain. The caretaker's words echoed in his mind again. "You're not the first to read her words." How many before him had found the diary, heard the humming, and vanished? Linton began to notice more strange details around the farmhouse. The humming wasn't constant. It grew louder on certain nights, especially near midnight. Shadows seemed to gather in corners that should have been empty. And once, as he examined the carvings in the cellar, he thought he saw fresh wax melting on one of the old candles, as if someone had recently been there. Driven by equal parts fear and obsession, he decided to return to the iron door beneath the chapel one last time. He needed proof, not just of the Reverend's crimes, but of what had endured after him. When he arrived, the snow was falling heavily, blanketing the ruins. He descended into the passage, lantern flickering. The air was suffocating, the hum deeper now, vibrating through the stone. He approached the iron door, running his fingers over the etched name, and noticed something new. The rust had been recently disturbed. Someone had tried to open it. Pinned beside the door, half hidden by dust, was a small scrap of parchment. Modern paper, not from the 1800s. The message, written in trembling ink, was short and chilling. "The light is patient. It feeds on those who remember." Linton's lantern sputtered. Behind the door, the humming rose to a low, steady growl, and in that moment he realized the truth. This was no longer a story of the past. The rituals of Hollow Creek had never ended. They were waiting for the next believer to open the door. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets as Professor Linton stood before the iron door, heart hammering like a drum inside his chest. The parchment still trembled in his hand. "The light is patient. It feeds on those who remember." He swallowed hard, the words echoing in his skull. For weeks he had chased the truth, convinced he was uncovering history, but now history was staring back, alive, breathing, and watching. He drew a deep breath and pressed his palm against the door. It was colder than ice, but there was movement behind it, faint, rhythmic, like the beating of a heart. He hesitated, his rational mind begging him to turn back. But curiosity, that ancient curse of scholars, pushed him forward. With a groan, the hinges began to shift. The door opened just enough to let a sliver of air escape, a wave of decay, mold, and something metallic like blood. Inside was a circular chamber, lit by candles so old their wax had fossilized into the floor. At the center stood a stone altar, its surface covered in strange carvings. But what froze him wasn't the altar, it was what lay upon it. A small wooden box. The same box Clara had written about in her final diary entry. Linton approached it slowly. His breath fogged the air, and his footsteps echoed far too loud. The box was open. Inside rested a locket, its metal tarnished, but the engraving still visible, C.M. Clara Moore. Beside it, half buried in the dust, was something impossible. A photograph dated 1923. It showed a group of men in ceremonial robes standing around the same altar. The man in the center was Elias Moore, his face serene, eyes closed, hands raised as if in prayer. But behind him, faintly visible in the candlelight, stood a small figure, a girl, pale and hollow-eyed, her expression empty. Clara. Linton staggered back, the realization slamming into him like a physical blow. The Reverend hadn't simply sacrificed the girl, he had bound her to the place, to the light, to his own bloodline. And the Moores had carried that curse for generations, worshipping the same light that consumed their ancestor. Each generation had performed the ritual again, not to end it, but to feed it. He turned toward the wall, noticing fresh markings etched into the stone, circles, intersecting lines, and beneath them, a date. 1973. T. Someone else had opened the chamber 50 years ago. Another light keeper. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. One of the candles shivered, though no wind touched it. Then another. The hum that had haunted him for nights returned, stronger, deeper, resonating inside his ribs. The shadows on the wall began to twist, merging into a form that was not quite human. Linton stumbled back, eyes wide. "Who's there?" he whispered. The voice that answered was not one voice, but many, a chorus of whispers overlapping, old and childlike, trembling with grief and fury. You opened it again. The air grew colder, the shadows pulsing like veins of darkness. He turned toward the doorway, but it was gone, swallowed by blackness. He tried to shout, but the words died in his throat. The whispers grew louder, circling him. He made us wait. He made us serve the light. In that instant, Linton saw them. Figures forming in the gloom. Men, women, children, all wearing the same vacant expressions as Clara in the photograph. Their eyes glowed faintly, not with life, but with reflection, mirroring the flickering candlelight. And at the center of them all, standing beside the altar, was Clara herself. Not the frightened child from the diary, but something older. Her eyes were deep hollows of light, her hands still clutching the locket from the box. "Clara," Linton whispered, tears blurring his vision. "You're real." Her voice was soft, echoing, layered with ages of sorrow. He said the light would save us. But it only took. She looked down at the box, then at Linton. "And now you brought it back." The chamber began to shake. Candles flared, the hum becoming a roar that tore through the walls. Linton stumbled forward, desperate to close the box, to end it, but his hands passed through the air as if through water. Clara reached out, touching his chest, and suddenly images flooded his mind. Elijah Moore preaching to a terrified congregation, the screams of children locked in darkness, and the endless cycle of rituals repeated through centuries. He saw Elias in 1923, reopening the chamber and binding the light again. He saw others after him, men and women of the Moore bloodline, drawn by guilt and devotion, each offering themselves to keep the light alive. And now, by opening the door, Linton had become part of that chain. The altar cracked. A beam of light, blinding and golden, burst upward, filling the chamber. But it wasn't divine. It burned, cold and merciless, consuming everything it touched. Linton felt it clawing at his skin, searing into his memory. "You remember," Clara whispered. "So it remembers you." Then silence. When the snow finally stopped falling over Hollow Creek, the chapel stood untouched, its ruins sealed beneath a fresh white blanket. Days later, the caretaker found the professor's lantern near the entrance, still warm. There was no sign of him, only a smear of soot leading toward the cellar and a single page torn from Clara's diary lying nearby. The page read, "The light was never holy. It was hunger." And at the bottom, in new ink, another hand had written, "The next one will remember." The next morning, Hollow Creek was bathed in a fragile calm, as if the night had erased itself from memory. Yet beneath the frost, the ground seemed restless, breathing, whispering. When the authorities arrived, they dismissed the old chapel as another collapsed ruin. No one mentioned the missing professor. No one spoke of the torn diary page found in the snow. History had swallowed them both, as it had done countless times before. But for those who knew the story of Clara Moore, something in the air had changed. Her tragedy was no longer confined to yellowed pages or whispered folklore. It had become a mirror, a reflection of what people were capable of in the name of salvation, obedience, or fear. The townsfolk spoke of lights flickering in their attics, of children waking to the sound of faint crying in the walls. Whether imagination or memory, the town could no longer pretend its ghosts were gone. The story of Clara's diary became a legend among historians. Some called it a myth, others believed it was a fragment of a much darker truth, the kind of truth that archives bury not because it is false, but because it feels too real. What Elias Moore did in 1856 was not unique. Across the world, in quiet corners of history, people had committed unspeakable acts believing they were protecting something sacred. They built their faith on fear, mistook control for purity, and called cruelty divine. And yet, what makes Clara's story endure is not the horror. It is the clarity it forces upon us. Her words, etched in trembling ink, weren't written to expose monsters, but to remind us that monsters often wear the faces of the righteous. Her suffering, and the centuries of silence that followed, revealed a truth humanity still wrestles with: that darkness doesn't always hide in shadows, it often thrives in light. Professor Linton's disappearance was never solved. His colleagues published his unfinished notes years later, and among them was a line scrawled in haste: "The past does not rest, it waits." Oh, Dish, that line became a haunting motto for those who study forgotten histories, a warning that every injustice left unspoken becomes a seed, waiting for the right century to bloom again. As decades passed, Hollow Creek decayed into memory. The chapel crumbled. The last descendants of the Moors moved away, but the locals still say that on certain winter nights, a soft glow rises from the ground where the altar once stood, not bright, but steady, like the flicker of a candle that refuses to die. And perhaps that is the truest meaning of Clara's diary. It was not a curse. It was a record, a demand that someone, someday, remember, that someone look at the cruelty of the past not as a relic, but as a mirror reflecting the choices we still make. Because if we forget her story, if we dismiss it as mere myth, then we open the door again, the same door Elias opened, the same one Linton could not close. And so her final words linger, suspended between centuries, carried by wind and memory. The light was never holy. It was hunger. But beneath those words lies a quieter truth, one Clara never wrote, but perhaps hoped someone would understand. That remembrance itself is resistance, that to tell her story, even now, is to deny the darkness its silence. And as long as her name is spoken, the light cannot consume everything. If you're still here, still listening to the echoes of Clara Moore's story, then you already understand something most people never will, that history is not silent and it never sleeps. Every forgotten name, every sealed door, every diary buried in dust waits for someone brave enough to remember. So now I'll ask you something simple but important. Do you believe Clara's diary was real, or just a legend born from guilt and fear? Type your answer below. Was the light she spoke of something supernatural, or a metaphor for the kind of cruelty humanity keeps repeating? I want to hear what you think. And remember that promise I made at the beginning? Here it is, a small secret for those who stayed until now. After Clara's diary was recovered in 1926, one final page went missing before the manuscript reached the university archives. But years later, a copy surfaced in a private collection, and on that page were the words, "If you read this, you've already opened the door." That page was authenticated, the ink, the paper, all matched. And yet, no one ever found who owned the collection or how that page vanished again after being catalogued. Now you tell me, coincidence or curse? Right, I've opened the door. In the comments if you'd dare to see what comes next. If stories like this send chills down your spine, if you believe that history still has shadows left unexplored, then this is where you belong. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to look away from the darker side of the past. Because the more we uncover, the harder it becomes for these ghosts to hide. And trust me, the next story will make you question what you thought you knew about time, faith, and what truly remains when history tries to bury the truth. The snow has long melted in Hollow Creek, but the echoes of that winter still linger, not in the air, but in the minds of those who dare to remember. The chapel is gone, the altar turned to dust, and yet sometimes travelers passing through the valley claim they see a faint shimmer between the trees, a pulse of pale light rising and fading like a heartbeat. They say if you follow it, you can still hear the sound of a child's voice, whispering words too soft to understand. But maybe that's just what happens when a story refuses to die. Clara Moore's name was nearly lost to time, but her diary brought her back. It forced us to look, not at ghosts, but at ourselves. Every age has its darkness. Every generation finds its own light to worship, its own excuses to blind itself. But stories like Clara E.S. remind us that truth can survive centuries of silence if someone is willing to keep the flame alive. And perhaps by listening, by remembering, we've become part of that fragile flame too. If you stayed until this very moment, you're not just an observer, you're a keeper. Type, I guard the memory bum below, and let it be known that her story wasn't forgotten. That for one night, in this small corner of the digital age, the past spoke again, and someone answered. And as for what comes next, well, history has an endless appetite. There are still diaries unopened, letters sealed, and graves that whisper under the soil. The next tale takes us far from Hollow Creek, across the ocean to a remote asylum in the Scottish Highlands, where a patient's drawings predicted events that wouldn't happen until 50 years later. The doctors called it madness. The church called it heresy. But the truth might be something else entirely. So until then, keep your lantern lit, your curiosity alive, and your heart steady against the shadows, because the past isn't done speaking, and the next voice you hear might just be calling your name.